What if I told you that somewhere in the deserts of the American Southwest there are stone formations older than recorded history? Formations that no one can explain. And according to some accounts, they're not just ancient monuments. They might be seals, barriers, something built thousands of years ago to keep something else out. Now here's the part that makes this story even stranger. For centuries, people have reported seeing the same group of women guarding these places, not once, not twice, but across different decades, even different centuries. Some witnesses described them wearing Apache clothing from the 1800s. Others claimed they wore Spanish colonial garments, and a few reports say their clothing looked like it belonged to no known culture at all. Who are they? Why do they appear only near these formations? And why have people who investigated too closely sometimes vanished without a trace? But the most disturbing detail isn't the disappearances. It's what some secret researchers believe those formations are actually doing. Because according to records collected over more than a century, those stones might be holding something back, something ancient, something that may not belong in our world at all. And if the theories are right, those barriers may not last forever. Before we dive into the story, I want to ask you something. If humanity discovered tomorrow that something ancient had been protecting us for thousands of years, would the world believe it? Or would people dismiss it as another myth? Drop your answer in the comments before the story starts, because by the end of this video, you might see this mystery very differently. And usually when history talks about wars, it usually focuses on generals, battles, and famous warriors. But every now and then, a story surfaces that makes historians pause and ask a different question. What if the most unsettling stories of the American frontier weren't about the men who fought the wars, but about the women who lived through them? Before we go deeper into this story, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel across the world. And as you listen, one more important thing to ask. Think about this. How much of history do you think never made it into official records? The story takes us back to the American Southwest in the mid-1800s. Between 1857 and 1886, the region that is now Arizona and New Mexico was at the center of a long and brutal conflict known as the Apache Wars. These clashes between the United States Army and different Apache groups stretched across decades and thousands of miles of unforgiving desert. The terrain itself was a challenge: blazing heat, endless rock formations, and canyons that could swallow entire patrols without leaving a trace. Most history books talk about well-known Apache leaders like Geronimo or Cochise. Their names appear again and again in military reports and frontier accounts. But scattered among those records are strange references, short notes, unfinished reports, and stories that were quietly pushed aside. Stories that didn't fit the usual narrative of the war. And many of those stories had something unexpected in common. They mentioned Apache women. September 1863. Fort Bowie, in what was then called the Arizona Territory. A cavalry officer, Captain William Harrison, sat in his quarters late at night, writing a report about a patrol mission that had gone terribly wrong. According to accounts from the fort's medical officer, Harrison looked shaken in a way few soldiers ever were. His normally neat handwriting had become jagged and rushed, as if he were trying to get the words out before he lost the courage to write them down. The patrol he described had been sent south of the fort after scouts reported movement in a canyon region the Apache sometimes referred to as the place of singing stones. 23 cavalrymen rode out to investigate. Only 2 returned. One of them reportedly died soon after arriving back at the fort, speaking incoherently and repeating phrases in Apache that none of the soldiers understood. The other survivor was Harrison himself, and what he described in that report was unlike anything the fort had recorded before. According to Harrison's account, his patrol followed signs of movement for 3 days through rough desert terrain. The journey alone pushed the soldiers to their limits. The heat was intense, water was scarce, and the rocky landscape made travel slow and exhausting. On the 3rd day, they reached a narrow canyon. Smoke drifted upward from within it. At first, Harrison believed they had finally located the group they were tracking. He ordered his men to dismount and move forward quietly on foot. But as they approached, they heard something unexpected. Singing. Soft voices echoing between the canyon walls. At first, it sounded distant, but the deeper they moved into the canyon, the more the sound surrounded them, bouncing strangely off the red stone formations. One soldier later described it as if the voices were coming from every direction at once. Eventually, the patrol reached an open space in the canyon, a natural amphitheater formed by towering rock walls. And there, according to Harrison's account, they saw a group of Apache women gathered around several fires. At first glance, the scene looked almost ordinary. The women appeared to be working calmly and methodically around the flames, as if preparing food or organizing supplies. But as the soldiers moved closer, the details became harder to ignore. Shapes were laid out carefully across the rocks. Too carefully. Harrison wrote that it took several seconds before his mind understood what he was actually looking at. The shapes were bodies. Remains of soldiers from another patrol that had gone missing weeks earlier. The sight shocked the cavalrymen. Several reportedly turned away immediately, unable to process what they were seeing. But what disturbed Harrison most wasn't simply the discovery itself. It was the atmosphere. The women continued their work calmly, almost as if the soldiers' presence didn't surprise them at all. One soldier in the patrol suddenly recognized something. Corporal James Mitchell from Tennessee stepped forward, staring at one of the figures on the rocks. According to Harrison's report, he whispered a name: his brother. Private Thomas Mitchell had been part of the missing patrol. The moment the name was spoken, the singing stopped. Every woman in the canyon turned toward the soldiers, and for the first time, Harrison saw their faces clearly. Later, he would say something that puzzled the officers at Fort Bowie. He had expected anger, or panic, or even fear. Instead, he saw something very different: focus. The same kind of concentration he had seen from skilled craftsmen or surgeons during difficult work. The women stood silently, watching the patrol with steady expressions. Harrison noticed details that he struggled to explain in his report. Some of the women wore traditional Apache clothing, but they were also decorated with unusual ornaments and painted symbols. Patterns covered their arms and faces, markings Harrison admitted he had never seen described in any military records about Apache customs. And there was one more thing he wrote about repeatedly: their eyes. He claimed that when the firelight reflected in them, the glow seemed to linger longer than it should, almost as if the light was slow to fade. Was it simply the flickering flames playing tricks on exhausted soldiers, or was it something else? What do you think? The patrol remained frozen in place, unsure what to do next. Then one woman stepped forward. Harrison estimated she was around 30 years old. Her long black hair was braided and decorated with small ornaments that clicked softly as she moved. And then something happened that surprised every soldier there. She spoke, not in Apache, in clear English. According to Harrison's account, she said only a short sentence, 7 words. The exact wording was never fully recorded in the surviving documents, but the soldiers later said the tone was calm, almost conversational. After speaking, the woman simply turned and walked toward the canyon wall, and the rest of the women followed. What happened next became the most mysterious part of Harrison's story. Instead of leaving through a visible path, the women moved toward the solid rock face at the edge of the canyon. The soldiers expected them to disappear through a hidden passage or narrow crevice, but according to Harrison's description, there was no obvious opening. Yet somehow, one by one, the women vanished from sight among the shadows of the stone. Within moments, the canyon was silent again. The patrol searched the area for hours afterward, examining every crack and ridge they could find. But the canyon walls appeared solid. No tunnels, no caves large enough to hide a group. Only one strange detail remained. Behind the place where the fires had been burning, the soldiers discovered a narrow fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through. And what they eventually found beyond that opening would make the entire situation even more unsettling. But before we continue, let me ask you something. If you had been part of that patrol, would you have gone inside that fissure to see what was there? After searching the canyon walls for any sign of where the women had gone, Captain Harrison noticed the narrow crack in the rock face. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. He turned to his men and gave a simple order. 5 volunteers, check inside, carefully. The soldiers hesitated. None of them liked the idea of crawling into an unknown cave after what they had just witnessed. But eventually 5 stepped forward and disappeared into the darkness of the fissure. Minutes passed, then 10. Finally, 3 soldiers emerged again, breathing heavily as they dragged something across the rocky ground. A metal strongbox, the kind used by the United States Army to store official documents. It was locked, sealed with a heavy chain, and completely out of place in a remote canyon deep inside Apache territory. Naturally, Harrison ordered it opened. Inside were dozens of military reports, and what they described made the entire patrol fall silent. The documents dated back as far as 1849. Each report described strange encounters in the desert, missing patrols, unexplained discoveries, and sightings that sounded eerily similar to what Harrison's men had just experienced. Again and again the same pattern appeared. Soldiers vanished during scouting missions, remains were later discovered arranged in unusual formations, witnesses reported seeing groups of women in remote places where no Apache camps were known to exist. But the most disturbing part was stamped across the top of nearly every document: suppressed by order. Different names appeared beside that order, various military commanders over the years, yet the result was always the same. The reports were sealed, buried, and forgotten. Which raises an interesting question. If these stories were simply rumors, why go through so much effort to hide them? Among the official reports was something even older, a worn leather journal written in Spanish. The first page was dated 1792. It belonged to a Franciscan missionary named Father Sebastian Diaz, who had traveled through the region centuries earlier while attempting to convert local tribes. His journal described encounters with a group of women he referred to as las brujas del desierto, the witches of the desert. But Diaz didn't describe them as mythical figures. He described meeting them, speaking with them. According to his writing, these women lived separately from the rest of Apache society, often in areas marked by unusual rock formations and remote canyons. They were rarely seen, but many people, both settlers and native communities, seemed aware of them. And the most mysterious part? Diaz wrote that the women claimed they were guardians of something. something they called las puertas, the doors. In the journal, Diaz carefully underlined that word several times, the doors. He wrote that the women told him their responsibility was to watch over certain places in the desert where, according to their traditions, the natural world was unstable, places where strange phenomena had been reported for generations. According to Diaz, the women described these locations as boundaries, points where different forces, spiritual or natural, seemed to interact in ways people didn't fully understand. At one point in the journal, he claimed they even showed him one of these places, inside a cave. Diaz's handwriting changed dramatically when he reached that part of the story. It became shaky and uneven. He described seeing a strange shimmer in the air deep inside the cave, like heat waves rising from desert sand, but stronger. Looking at it too long, he wrote, gave him headaches and made his vision blur. He also mentioned hearing faint sounds echoing through the rock, sounds he could not identify. Now, whether this was a real physical phenomenon or simply a frightened traveler trying to explain something unfamiliar, historians still debate. But according to Diaz's account, the women believed those locations had to be protected. They claimed their rituals and traditions were meant to keep those places stable, to prevent disturbances that might spread beyond the canyon. Diaz asked them what would happen if those places were ever left unguarded. The women responded by showing him ancient cave paintings. He described symbols and shapes unlike anything he had seen in Spanish or indigenous artwork before. His final clear entry in the journal suggested the paintings represented a rupture in the natural world, something he struggled to describe in words. 3 days later, his journal entries changed completely. The last pages were filled with a single repeated sentence, written again and again in frantic handwriting. "They are coming through the walls, and I cannot make them stop." After that, the journal ended. No further entries. Captain Harrison's patrol carried the strongbox back to Fort Bowie. What happened next raised even more questions. By the following morning, 3 government investigators had already arrived at the fort. According to later accounts, no telegraph message had been sent requesting their presence. Yet somehow they knew. They immediately confiscated the strongbox, the documents, and Harrison's written report. Then they issued a direct warning. Any soldier who discussed the incident publicly could face court-martial for spreading panic. Fortunately, the fort's doctor, Dr. Webb, quietly copied some of the material before it disappeared into military archives. Without that copy, the entire incident might have vanished from history completely. The canyon itself was eventually marked on military maps as dangerous terrain. Officially, the explanation was simple: unstable rock formations and unsafe travel conditions. But travelers passing through the region in the following decades reported unusual experiences. Strange echoes moving through empty canyons, lights appearing briefly among the rocks at night, and occasionally, figures seen standing on distant ridges, women who seemed to appear suddenly and vanish just as quickly. Now, of course, desert landscapes can create powerful illusions, mirages, strange echoes, shifting lights, but the reports continued for years, and some soldiers stationed in Arizona Territory began sharing quiet stories among themselves. Stories about patrols that disappeared, stories about fighters who seemed to know the terrain better than any map could explain. Stories about women who appeared in battle and vanished into the desert without leaving tracks. In 1868, General William Tecumseh Sherman visited Fort Bowie. That part is well documented in military records. What the official records don't mention is something that appeared years later in a personal letter he wrote to his wife. According to that letter, Sherman held a private meeting at the fort with 3 Apache women who arrived under a flag of truce. No translator was present, and Sherman never officially recorded what they discussed. But in his letter, he wrote something historians still debate today. He described the meeting as one of the most unusual and unsettling conversations of his military career. Soon after that visit, Sherman ordered several regions of Arizona Territory to be avoided during military operations. The official explanation listed strategic reasons, but historians later noticed something interesting. Those restricted areas matched locations mentioned in the earlier reports. Places with unusual rock formations. Places Father Diaz had written about decades earlier. Places that Apache oral traditions described as spiritually significant. By the early 1870s, a strange pattern had begun appearing in scattered reports. Witnesses from completely different decades described seeing the same women who did not appear to age. Descriptions that matched across generations. A woman with long black hair decorated with bone ornaments. A woman with a crescent-shaped scar across her left palm. Another wearing a necklace made of 7 unusual stones. These figures appeared in stories from Spanish explorers in the 1500s, French traders in the 1700s, and American soldiers in the 1800s. Were these simply legends passed down and retold, or was something stranger happening in the deserts of the Southwest? One officer who later wrote about his experiences was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reno. Years before the famous Battle of Little Bighorn, Reno had served in Arizona Territory during Apache conflicts. His official military reports were ordinary, lists of patrol routes and engagements, but his private journal told a different story. In one entry, he described an ambush involving Apache fighters that included several women. Reno wrote that the encounter felt unlike any battle he had experienced before. The fighters seemed to anticipate his movements, using the terrain in ways that made pursuit nearly impossible. According to his notes, some of his soldiers even believed the women were somehow predicting their tactics. Of course, experienced fighters who know the land well can often appear almost supernatural to outsiders. But Reno admitted something unusual about the encounter stayed with him long afterward. And that raises another question. Were these simply incredibly skilled warriors, or were the soldiers witnessing something they didn't fully understand? Because the deeper researchers dig into these old records, the stranger the story becomes. In his private journal, Lieutenant Colonel Reno later admitted something unusual. During one particular clash with Apache fighters, he ordered a retreat. For most commanders of the time, retreat without direct authorization was almost unthinkable. Yet Reno wrote that he believed continuing the fight would have destroyed his entire command, so he pulled his men back. Later that night, he sketched one of the fighters he had seen. The drawing wasn't perfect, but a few details stood out clearly. Long, dark hair, traditional Apache clothing, and around her neck, a necklace made of 7 stones tied to a leather cord. That same necklace had appeared in several earlier reports spanning generations, which is where the story begins to get strange, because men who had never met, soldiers, missionaries, explorers, had all written something very similar after encountering these women. One line appeared again and again in private notes and journals, a line that seemed less like an explanation and more like a warning. They are not trying to win the war. They are trying to prevent something worse. Think about that for a moment. If the conflict itself was not the true goal, then what exactly were they trying to stop? By the early 1870s, the U.S. Army decided to quietly investigate something else connected to these stories. In 1874, an official geological survey was ordered in southern Arizona Territory. Publicly, the mission sounded routine. map the land, study mineral resources, evaluate whether the region could support new settlements. But years later, a declassified memorandum revealed a second objective. The survey team had also been tasked with locating the unusual stone formations mentioned in earlier suppressed reports. The expedition was led by Professor Jonathan Whitmore, a respected geologist from Harvard University. Whitmore had spent years studying unusual rock structures and desert formations. He was brilliant, but he had absolutely no idea what kind of stories surrounded the places he was about to investigate. Whitmore's expedition consisted of 12 men, scientists, soldiers assigned as guards, and a small support team to handle supplies and travel. They departed from Fort Bowie in early April. The plan was simple: spend about 3 months mapping the region and return with their findings. But something unexpected happened. The expedition returned after only 7 weeks, and only 8 men came back. Professor Whitmore was not among them. The surviving members of the team gave reports that differed in small details, but they all agreed on the essential events. They had discovered dozens of strange stone formations scattered across the desert. Individually, the formations looked like natural rock pillars or weathered monuments shaped by centuries of wind and erosion. But when Whitmore plotted their locations on a map, something unusual appeared. They formed a pattern. The men could not agree on what the pattern represented. One described it as a spiral stretching across miles of desert. Another thought it resembled a massive star shape with many points. A third believed it looked like a form of writing, symbols far larger than anything humans normally create. Whatever the pattern meant, Whitmore became fascinated, almost obsessed. He spent days measuring the formations, sketching them, photographing them, and collecting small rock samples. Eventually, the team reached the largest formation they had found. Whitmore insisted on setting up camp nearby so he could study it more closely. Their Apache guide, a man named Natsili, strongly opposed the idea. According to the survivors, Natsili had guided soldiers across the desert for years and had never shown fear before. But that night, something changed. He warned the group not to stay near the stones after dark. When Whitmore refused to move the camp, Natsili quietly packed his belongings and left. 3 days later, he arrived back at Fort Bowie alone. He immediately resigned his position and left the territory entirely. The army never saw him again. Which makes you wonder, what exactly frightened him so badly? According to the surviving members of Whitmore's expedition, the answer may have come the very next night. They were sitting around the campfire when something unusual happened. Several of the survivors claimed they saw movement near the stone formations. At first, they assumed it was shadows shifting in the firelight. But then, figures began to appear. Women, standing between the towering stones. Now here's where the accounts become difficult to explain. Several of the survivors insisted the women did not approach from the surrounding desert. Instead, they seemed to step out from the stone formations themselves. Not from caves, not from behind rocks, but from the formations as if they had simply been standing there unnoticed moments earlier. Professor Whitmore reacted in a way that surprised everyone. Rather than panic, he stood up calmly and walked toward the figures. According to his assistant, Gerald Morton, Whitmore behaved as if he had been expecting them. The women formed a circle around him. For nearly an hour, they spoke together. The rest of the expedition watched from their fire, too far away to hear clearly. Morton later wrote that the voices sounded like a conversation, but the language was unfamiliar. Whitmore appeared to understand them. At times he seemed to argue. At other moments he appeared to plead. Then, according to the witnesses, one of the women stepped forward and placed her hand gently against Whitmore's forehead. Whitmore collapsed. When the sun rose the next morning, both the women and Whitmore were gone. But something remained. In the dirt where they had been standing, someone had drawn a strange symbol. The shape matched drawings found earlier in Father Diaz's journal. It also resembled markings the expedition had documented in nearby caves. No one in the group could explain what it meant. Later that morning, one of the surviving men noticed something else. A single figure standing on a distant ridge. A woman with long dark hair, small bone ornaments woven through it, and a necklace made of 7 stones. The same detail mentioned in reports spanning centuries. She raised one hand, pointed toward the north, and then disappeared behind the rocks. That was enough for the expedition. They packed immediately and began riding north. No one argued. No one asked to stay longer. They simply left. 3 days later, they discovered something even stranger. Professor Whitmore. He was alive. He was sitting cross-legged in the center of one of the stone circles the team had previously mapped. Surrounding him were hundreds of dead birds, ravens, hawks, vultures, all lying in a circular pattern around him. None showed any visible injuries. Whitmore never explained what happened. In fact, he never spoke again. He spent the next 37 years in a Massachusetts asylum. Doctors described him as completely unresponsive most of the time, except for one strange habit. Every night, at midnight, Whitmore would walk to the nearest wall. He would press his ear against it and listen. Sometimes he cried, sometimes he smiled, and sometimes he whispered a single word: closer. The Army's official report later blamed the incident on exhaustion and heat exposure. The 4 men who died during the expedition were listed as casualties of Apache attacks, and the stone formations themselves were declared off-limits to both soldiers and civilians. But despite the official explanation, strange reports continued. Between 1874 and 1886, similar incidents kept appearing in scattered military records. Patrols encountering unusual fighters, soldiers discovering strange patterns near remote stone formations, witnesses describing women who appeared unchanged across decades, the same jewelry, the same descriptions, the same unsettling calm. By the early 1880s, a small group of soldiers who had experienced these encounters began quietly sharing information with each other. They compared notes, they mapped locations, they studied dates and patterns. Their goal was simple: to understand what they had witnessed and to answer one question that refused to disappear. If those women were truly guarding something in the desert, what exactly were they protecting the world from? Over the following years, Blackwood's group began digging deeper into the past. They searched through Spanish colonial archives in missions across the Southwest. They tracked down scattered church records that had been sealed for decades. Eventually, they even located descendants of Father Sebastian Diaz in Mexico City and gained access to additional writings the church had quietly preserved. What they uncovered did not offer comfort, but strangely, it seemed to fit everything they had already discovered. According to their research, the strange stone formations scattered across the deserts of Arizona, New Mexico, western Texas, and northern Mexico were not natural formations at all. They had been deliberately placed, and when Blackwood's group plotted their locations on maps, a disturbing pattern appeared. One of the group members, a former cartographer named David Sutton, noticed something unusual about that pattern. It resembled an astronomical map, but it wasn't any constellation known to modern science. Some of the points matched familiar stars. Others didn't exist in any chart of the sky. It was as if someone had mapped the heavens and then added new stars that should not exist. The age of the formations raised even more questions. According to geological samples Sutton studied, The structures appeared to be at least 15,000 years old, possibly much older. That would mean they existed long before the Apache arrived in the region, long before the Spanish explorers, possibly even before any known human civilization in North America. Yet somehow, these formations had remained intact for thousands of years, maintained, protected, kept clear of erosion, which leads to an obvious question: who had been watching over them for all that time? When Blackwood's group spoke with Apache scouts and elders willing to share their traditions, they heard similar stories repeated again and again. Stories about women who existed outside normal tribal lineage, women who did not belong to any clan, women who had always been there. In some stories, they were called the Guardians, in others, the Watchers. In the oldest tales, they were simply known as the Bound Ones. The stories all agreed on a few things. The women existed before the Apache arrived in the desert. They would exist long after the tribes were gone. They could not leave their posts. They could not rest. And, according to the legends, they could not die. Father Diaz's hidden writings offered another piece of the puzzle. He described the mysterious doors not as metaphors, but as literal rifts in reality itself, places where the normal laws of the world began to break down. He claimed the women once allowed him to glimpse what existed on the other side, only for a moment, but even that moment left him deeply shaken. Diaz wrote that human minds were simply not built to process what lay beyond those openings. He believed even seeing it briefly could damage a person's sanity, and prolonged exposure might completely destroy the mind. But what frightened him most was not what existed beyond the doors. It was the belief that the doors were slowly opening. According to Diaz, the women performed their strange rituals for a specific reason, not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. He believed they were trying to reinforce whatever barriers kept those doors sealed. The details of how they did it were unclear in the writings, but the implication was unsettling. Every event in the desert, every strange encounter, every disappearance near the formations might have been connected to that same desperate effort. Diaz wrote that the women had carried this burden silently for longer than recorded history, guarding something, holding something back, something they believed humanity was not ready to face. When Blackwood's group considered all of this information together, they reached a disturbing possibility. If the stories were even partly true, then the conflicts in the desert might have been about more than territory or politics. The fighting may have been drawing people closer and closer to the ancient formations. And that raised a terrifying question. Were those encounters happening by chance? Or had events in the region been quietly influenced by forces no one understood? In 1881, Blackwood and several members of the group made a decision. They wanted answers. More than that, they wanted to understand the role they might play in whatever was happening. So they set out toward the place known as the Singing Stones. They carried no weapons, only letters explaining what they had learned and why they had come. 6 men rode into the desert that September. None of them returned. Search parties later combed the area. No bodies, no signs of violence, no trace at all. It was as if they had simply vanished into the landscape. But a strange story began circulating at Fort Bowie 3 months later. One night in December, a sentry reported seeing a figure standing on a distant ridge, a soldier watching the fort. When the sentry looked through his field glass, he believed he recognized the man, Sergeant Blackwood, the same man who had disappeared weeks earlier. According to the sentry, Blackwood stood silently on the ridge until dawn, Then, as the sunlight touched the desert, the figure slowly faded from view. The sentry was later disciplined for allegedly drinking on duty, but over the next year, several other soldiers claimed to see the same figure at different forts, always at night, always silent, always gone by sunrise. When Geronimo finally surrendered in 1886, the Apache Wars officially ended. But the strange reports did not disappear. In fact, they became harder to explain. Without the cover of active warfare, the disappearances near the stone formations stood out more clearly. Prospectors vanished, surveyors disappeared, telegraph workers went missing along remote desert routes. The Army quietly expanded restricted zones around certain areas. Maps labeled them as dangerous terrain. Patrols were assigned to keep civilians away. Yet the pattern continued. By the early 1900s, the secret network Blackwood had helped create had grown larger. Its members called themselves the Watchers. Their purpose was simple: monitor the formations, record unusual activity, and protect the locations from anyone wandering too close. Over time, they compiled thousands of reports, and by 1920, those records revealed something troubling. The strange rituals near the formations appeared to be happening more frequently. What once occurred every few months was now happening every few weeks. Something seemed to be changing. Something was putting pressure on whatever those ancient barriers were meant to hold back. In 1937, a geological survey detected unusual readings beneath one of the largest formations. Seismic equipment picked up massive underground chambers far deeper than natural caves should exist. Even stranger, the instruments recorded rhythmic vibrations, slow, heavy, almost like something enormous moving deep beneath the earth. The Watchers sent a geologist named Catherine Price to investigate. Her team mapped an enormous underground network of tunnels stretching for hundreds of miles, all converging toward a single central chamber beneath the largest formation. But Price made one final discovery that puzzled everyone involved. While studying the old symbols drawn by soldiers decades earlier, she noticed something remarkable. When she overlaid those symbols onto her seismic maps, the shapes matched perfectly. The underground structures mirrored the exact same patterns, as if the symbols were not decorations, not warnings, but a map of something buried deep beneath the desert, something that had been there for thousands of years, something that might still be there today. And that leaves us with one final question. If those ancient formations were truly designed to contain something, if the women of the desert were really guarding those mysterious doors, then the real mystery may not be what happened in the 1800s. The real mystery is this: are those doors still sealed today, or have they already begun to open? If you've made it this far, tell me your thoughts in the comments, and also share which country you're watching from, because stories like this, stories hidden between history and legend, deserve to be remembered. Imagine discovering that everything people see on the surface is only a tiny piece of something far bigger. Price's team slowly realized that the tunnels and underground chambers they had mapped were not random at all. When they overlaid the underground scans with the formations above ground, a chilling pattern appeared. The symbols matched, but underground, those same shapes were massive, stretching across huge sections of the bedrock beneath the southwest. What people saw above ground, the strange formations, the ancient markers, might have only been signposts. The real structure, the real seals, were buried far below. And the deeper researchers looked, the more unsettling the question became. If the formations above were already estimated to be 15,000 years old, then how old could the network beneath them possibly be? Price's team decided to test one of the chambers. They drilled a probe into the rock and carefully lowered it down. For a while, everything seemed normal. The probe passed 100 feet, 200 feet. Then at 300 feet, something strange happened. The cable suddenly jerked. "Wait, did something just grab it?" one technician reportedly asked. Before anyone could react, the tension spiked and the cable snapped. When they pulled back the remaining piece of equipment, the metal looked wrong. Not broken, not crushed, but changed. According to the analysis logs, the material had been altered at a molecular level, forming patterns that shouldn't exist under normal conditions. No one in the lab could explain it, and that was the moment the team decided it was time to leave. But as they began evacuating the site, something else happened. They heard singing. Soft at first, high voices, clear, almost echoing across the ridges. The exact same kind of singing Captain Harrison had described 74 years earlier. When the sound stopped, the team looked up. Women stood along the surrounding ridges, dozens of them, perfectly still. Price counted 37. Some wore clothing resembling Apache styles from the 1800s. Others looked like they stepped out of Spanish colonial history, and a few wore garments that didn't resemble any known culture at all. The women didn't move, they didn't threaten anyone, they simply watched. As Price's convoy prepared to leave, she took one last look back. One of the women stepped forward. She had long black hair woven with small bones, and around her neck hung a necklace with 7 dark stones. The woman raised her hand and pointed toward the ground, toward the tunnels, toward whatever lay beneath them. Then she placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head. Price later wrote that the gesture felt like two things at once, an acknowledgement and a plea. From that moment forward, Price dedicated her life to understanding what the women were doing. She joined the secret monitoring group known as the Watchers and eventually rose to lead it. Under her leadership, the organization expanded dramatically. They built monitoring stations across the Southwest, recruited scientists, geologists, historians, and even quietly coordinated with certain government agencies. For decades, they studied the formations and the strange signals coming from below. Price continued this work until her death in 1989, just days after the Berlin Wall fell. Most people saw those events as completely unrelated. But in her final days, Price insisted they were connected. She believed something far stranger might be happening behind human history. Her theory? That many of humanity's major conflicts, wars, revolutions, upheavals, were not entirely random. She believed they might somehow be tied to the mysterious system of seals beneath the earth, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. According to her interpretation, the women had been guiding events for thousands of years, influencing human civilization just enough to maintain the forces needed to sustain the barriers. A desperate attempt to keep something contained. By the early 2000s, the Watchers had technology that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations: satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, seismic monitoring stations, advanced computer models analyzing decades of geological data. And every new tool revealed the same disturbing trend. The seals were weakening. Stones that had remained unchanged for thousands of years began to show cracks. Tiny fissures spread across surfaces that should have resisted erosion for millennia. Meanwhile, the vibrations coming from deep underground grew stronger, more frequent, more urgent, almost rhythmic, as if something far below was pushing. Reports of the mysterious women also increased. Sightings came from across the Southwest. They appeared more often, in more places, always performing the same strange rituals, always working with growing urgency. Then, in 2012, something happened that had never happened before. One of the women made direct contact. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, she walked into the Watchers' headquarters in Tucson, Arizona. No secrecy, no disguise, just straight through the front door. She looked completely normal, jeans, a plain shirt, but around her neck hung the unmistakable necklace of 7 ancient stones. She gave only one name: Speaker. The organization's leader at the time, Richard Coleman, personally recorded what happened next. Speaker told him the era of secrecy was ending. The seals, she explained, were weakening faster than expected. Within the next 100 years, maybe sooner, they would fail completely. Coleman asked the obvious question: what happens when they fail? Speaker's answer haunted him for the rest of his life. The world will remember what it was like before maps were needed, she said, because there will be more than one world sharing the same space. Before leaving, Speaker handed over files, data supposedly collected across 15,000 years, mathematical models, predictions, descriptions of similar collapses that had happened long before recorded history. According to those records, ancient civilizations had faced the same crisis, and they had failed. Some researchers believe the evidence of those failures may still exist today, in places people describe as cursed, haunted, or strangely wrong. Places where people disappear, places where reality doesn't seem to behave the way it should. According to the files, the Apache women represented the last successful defense humanity had ever had. They had held the line for 15,000 years, but even they couldn't hold it forever. Eventually, the barriers would fall, the doors would open, and whatever waited on the other side would finally step through. Before she left, Coleman asked one final question: why do you do this? Why carry this burden for so long? Speaker smiled. Coleman later described it as both deeply sad and incredibly kind. Because someone must, she said quietly, because the alternative is unthinkable. Then she added something even stranger. You are our children, even if you no longer remember us as your mothers. And with that, she walked out of the building and disappeared into the streets of Tucson. The Watchers never saw her again, but sightings of the women never stopped. They are still out there, still performing their rituals, still protecting something, still buying humanity time. But here's the real question. If the seals truly are weakening, what exactly have they been holding back all this time? And more importantly, how much time do we really have left? Let me know what you think. Do you believe stories like this could be based on forgotten history, or are they simply modern legends? Drop your thoughts below. I seriously want to know. What do you guys think about it? Today, the organization known as the Watchers is much larger than it once was. More than 200 researchers, analysts, and field operatives quietly work across the American Southwest and in several other regions. Officially, they appear to be ordinary professionals. Some conduct environmental research. Others claim to be archaeologists studying ancient sites. Some present themselves as geologists monitoring seismic activity. To the outside world, they look like normal scientific teams, but their real mission is something very different. They monitor the formations. They track unusual seismic vibrations. They analyze cracks appearing in structures that have supposedly remained stable for thousands of years. And occasionally, something else happens. Late at night, when the desert is silent and the moon disappears from the sky, people sometimes report seeing figures standing on distant ridges. Women, still, watching. Their clothing doesn't look modern. Some appear to be dressed in styles from centuries ago. Others wear garments that seem older than any recorded history. And then, just as quietly as they appear, they vanish. Most travelers who pass through those deserts never notice the formations scattered across the landscape. They drive by them without a second thought. But according to the watchers, those formations might be part of something much larger, something ancient, something humanity barely understands. The women people call the Apache guardians may not belong to any single culture at all. Some researchers believe they are protectors of a tradition far older than any tribe or civilization, a responsibility passed down for thousands of years, a responsibility that requires sacrifice few people could imagine. And according to the data left behind by the mysterious visitor known as Speaker, the situation may be changing. The question is no longer if the seals will weaken. The question is when. Based on the models in those ancient files, the first major failure could happen sometime between 2050 and 2075. That might sound far away, but in terms of geological time, it's incredibly close. So what happens then? Will humanity be ready? Will scientists find new ways to strengthen whatever barriers might exist? Will technology evolve fast enough to understand what earlier civilizations could not? Or will we simply be forced to confront mysteries that humanity has ignored for centuries? Think about that for a moment. If humanity discovered tomorrow that something ancient was protecting us from forces we barely understand, how would the world react? Would people believe it? Or would they dismiss it as another myth? Before she disappeared, Speaker reportedly asked the watchers to remember something important. Not fear, not panic, but gratitude. Because for thousands of years, someone has been standing guard. Someone has carried a burden the rest of the world never even knew existed. And whether the legends are true or not, there's something powerful about that idea. That somewhere, unseen by most of us, there are people dedicating their lives to protecting others. Holding the line. Doing difficult things without recognition. It's a reminder that history isn't always written in textbooks. Sometimes it exists in forgotten places, in quiet sacrifices, in people who never ask for credit. So maybe the real lesson isn't about ancient seals or hidden worlds. Maybe it's about something simpler, the idea that courage often happens in silence, that responsibility sometimes means protecting others even when they don't realize it, and that the people who keep the world moving forward are often the ones no one notices. Because every person you meet might be fighting a battle you can't see. Every life holds struggles hidden beneath the surface, and sometimes the strongest people are the ones quietly holding things together. Out in the desert, the formations still stand, the watchers are still watching, and according to the stories, the women are still there too, still performing their rituals, still protecting something, still buying humanity a little more time. But now I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think legends like this could come from forgotten pieces of history, or do you believe they're simply stories created to explain mysteries we don't yet understand? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoy deep mystery stories like this one, make sure you subscribe, because the next story might make you question reality even more. Okay, so after hearing this entire story, one question still remains. If something like this were real, if there really were ancient guardians silently protecting humanity from something beyond our understanding, would we even recognize their sacrifice, or would we ignore it until it was too late? Think about that for a moment. Because throughout history, many discoveries once called myths eventually turned out to be real. Ancient cities, lost civilizations, technologies people thought were impossible. So here's the question I want every single one of you to answer. Do you think stories like this are completely fictional, or do you believe they might be inspired by real mysteries hidden somewhere in history? Type one word in the comments. Myth, if you think this is just a legend. Mystery, if you think there could be some truth behind it. I'm genuinely curious to see what most people think. And while you're down there, tell me this too. If you were standing in the desert at night and saw those women watching from a distant ridge, would you walk toward them or turn around and leave immediately? Let me know in the comments. I read as many of them as I can. And if you enjoy deep mystery stories like this one, subscribe and stick around because the next story might make you question reality even more. Until then, stay curious.